Hey everybody, how are you doing? So today's video is a multi-series part video about how to set up Docker and also all the downloading services such as SAB NZBD or Sonar or Sickbeard, things like that. We are going to be using the power of Docker. I already have my environment set up over here under Proxmox, which is a virtualization environment or a virtualization server. You can see here my server is quite modest. It's not super duper, but it's a 3300X, which is a 4-core 8-thread CPU. However, I do have 64 gigabytes of RAM. As you can see already, with just a few VMs and containers, I'm already 50% there. However, my setup works really well for me, and the Ryzen 3300X CPU is a stellar performer when it comes to workloads like this. Usually with a server type workload, the more threads the better. It's all about the cores and threads you give the server. So with that preamble out of the way, let's start. So you could install Docker bare metal. So by bare metal, I mean directly onto the host computer. So you would install Linux, whichever flavor you're comfortable with, and then set up Docker and then all the containers to enable your downloading. Another alternative is to use a virtualization platform. So there are many out there, the most prominent being VMware, but there's also Citrix Zen Server, Microsoft Hyper-V. We have XCP-ng, which is a fork of Zen Server, Citrix Zen Server, and we have Proxmox, which is, I would say, probably the most open source out of the way, out of them all, because it uses a standard Linux virtualization software, but it's wrapped it up all in a nice GUI here. I really like Proxmox. I've found it to be extremely stable. It works really well, and I've had no issues with it, and I have even paid them for the subscription. I like them so much. I feel it's money very well spent. It's not necessary to give the subscription or to get the subscription. However, I do it because I want to support the Proxmox group and see that more enhancements are being made to their server or the server solution. With that out of the way, it really doesn't matter which method you use. In the end, it'll be roughly the same. What I like doing is the virtual route, simply because I can consolidate all my VMs into one machine as opposed to having multiple machines. However, that being said, if you do have a spare machine, this would be a perfect candidate to install Proxmox and practice virtualization as well as Docker, even Kubernetes, or Ansible, things like that. So there's a fair bit of debate on what host OS to use. By host OS, I mean Ubuntu, Debian, any flavor of Linux, Red Hat, CentOS, SUSE Linux, Arch Linux. In the end, it doesn't really matter. I'm comfortable with Ubuntu and Debian-based systems. That's why I like sticking to Ubuntu. But I have tried it with Fedora and other distributions. It works just fine. In the end, honestly, it doesn't matter what you use to accomplish the task. The important thing is that the task is accomplished and you are comfortable accomplishing the task and you know how to administer and maintain the system. So I will be using a Ubuntu-based VM. I like using Ubuntu. So first things first is we're going to go to Ubuntu. And you want to download the ISO. So we're going to go to download, and we're going to download the server. As you can see here, the latest version is 20.04 LTS, which is a long-term support. So let's click that. And you can see the sub version is 20.04.01. Okay, so that is the latest one. We can use that. So let's download it here. I use a download manager. It speeds up my downloads. By the way, in case if you're interested about this downloader, I've been using it for over 20 years now. It's called Internet Download Manager. I even, have registered it. I've paid for it. It is a fantastic piece of software, and I honestly refuse to download anything without it, simply because a lot of servers throttle the connections, meaning you can see here that even though the connections are throttled, there's about 8 connections to the server, and I'm pretty much maxing out my internet speeds right now. After you use a download manager like this, going back to just your browser is really painful. So I'm quite used to this. And one beautiful thing about these download managers is you can hit pause and you can resume immediately from there. Okay, so that was very, very quick. The ISO is downloaded. So what we're going to do is we're going to upload the ISO to Proxmox. So as you can see here, I already have an ISO uploaded there, but I've got a couple of ISOs uploaded there, but I am going to upload the ISO again, just so we can see. So downloads, here we go. Click that, upload. So what this is doing is copying the ISO directly to the storage on Proxmox, so that we can use this ISO to create VMs. So there we go. The ISO is uploaded. You can see here that it's the one here. So it's the 20.04.1. So we're going to click the main node here, Proxmox, and we're going to click Create VM. So the name which we're going to call it is up to you. I use Docker Ubuntu for my existing setup. It doesn't really matter, but we're going to call it Docker Ubuntu U2. First thing you want to do at this screen here is click the Start at Boot, simply because if you reboot your Proxmox server, you want this virtual machine to start up also. If you have this unchecked, if you restart your machine or the machine, power cut or anything like that, the machine does reboot. This virtual machine will not boot up with the machine. So I like keeping it on. We're going to click Next, and we're going to select the ISO image we want. As you can see here, this was the latest one we downloaded, which is the 20.04.1. So we're going to click that. And the guest OS, the type is Linux, and it is a 5x kernel, so we're going to leave it 5x-2.6 kernel. We're going to hit Next. Here, there's a lot of things you can do here to play around with, especially if you want to pass through hardware. But in my case, I'm not going to pass through any hardware to my Docker containers or to this VM. Hence, I'm going to leave it all as default. We'll click Next. By default, Proxmox sets a 32 gigabyte storage space for it. I feel 32 gigabytes is a little bit too small for Docker, because once you start using Docker, you will love it and you will be using it a lot. So I like to max this out as much as I can, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to set it to 64 gigabytes. We're going to hit Next. And here's where the cores come in. So there's a lot of ways you can configure this. You can have, for example, I'll give you an example, is that you can say my CPU here is a 4 core but 8 thread. So let's just focus on the 8 thread part. So I can do it this way. I can do either 2 sockets and 4 cores for each socket, so it gives you a total of 8 cores. There's benefits to doing this, but it is better to do it the traditional way, which is 1 socket and 8 cores. So we're going to give this virtual machine 1 socket configuration and access to all 8 of the cores. If you want to tweak it more, you can reduce this, but I like keeping it at 8. Next. Now, this is where the important part comes in. First of all, I do not like ballooning devices, so I will uncheck that. I like to give the VM a hard memory limit, and we're going to give it 16 gigabytes. You could start with 8 and increase it to 16. In fact, let's do that. We're going to go in multiples of 1024. So 8 gigabytes would be 8196. So that's, as you can see here, 1024 multiplied by 8. Sorry, it's 8192. My bad. 8192. It's good to use the calculator sometimes. We're going to hit Next. For here, It really depends what you like to use. Some people say put it at Intel E1000, but I've had no issues with a paravirtualized VirtIO model of Ethernet card. So I'm going to leave it as the defaults. And we're going to hit next. Once all this is done, you can see the synopsis of what you've done. So we've set the balloon to 0, cores 8, so on and so forth, all the stats for the VM. The other option is to click here, which is start after created, but I like to do that manually. So I'm going to hit finish. So this creates the VM here, you can see here. So status is unknown, it's still building the VM. But the minute I start it, it'll be live. As you can see here, that's why I give it a little bit of time, because I want to see if everything is all done. Also, another thing is that, it's always good to go inside your hardware section here. Just make sure everything is all good before you give it a start. And I think everything is good, so we're going to give it a start. So the VM has booted and we are now in the first screen, first input screen. So depending on your language, whichever language you want to use, just select that. So I'm going to select English. And as you can see here, the layout, keyboard layout is English, the variant is English. That's fine. I'm going to hit done. And you can set up static IPs. For this video, I'm just going to leave it as on DHCP. As you can see here, it's been issued 176. So we're going to hit next. There's no proxy that I use, so I'm going to hit next. And since I'm based in Canada, it automatically selected the Canadian mirror for Ubuntu, which is perfect. So I'm going to hit done. And again, you can customize your storage layout, but because this is a virtual machine, I like to keep things simple. So I'm just going to use the entire disk and tab my way all the way to done. Right over here, done is highlighted. I'm going to hit done. Again, this gives you a summary of what's going to happen. So you can see here your mount points, your volume groups, devices, whatnot, the way it's going to be formatted, your partitions. We're going to hit done. And it's going to give you a warning message saying that this is a destructive action, meaning that it will format the contents. But since this is a VM with 64 gigs, it's only going to format that 64 gigs in this VM, not your actual SSD. So we're just going to hit continue and hit enter. So we're going to pick up my name. So Z, my server's name, we're going to call it Docker Ubuntu YouTube. We're going to pick a username. So we're going to pick the username of Z. Password is Z and Z. Again, try to make this stronger so that you don't get hacked. In the next screen, we're going to install SSH simply because we can administer the server via SSH rather than using this GUI utility here. There's nothing wrong with using GUI utilities like this, like the viewport into here, into the VM. However, I find the performance and the responsiveness on SSH much better. So that is selected. If you have an SSH identity, you can import it from GitHub or Launchpad. But since I do not, it's going to be just that. So I'm going to hit done. And there's a lot of options here to install, even Docker, for example. But I haven't really experimented with this here. I think it would run fine, but I don't know if Canonical, the people who make Ubuntu, do anything specific that, is specific to them or not. But I personally don't like using it this way. Furthermore, this is a little bit funny, simply because you think you're installing the actual Docker app, but as you can see here, these are snap packages. Is there a downside to using Snap? To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't even want to go there. I don't want to discuss that. I do know how to set it up without Snap, so I would rather do that. So in this case, I will leave everything unchecked and go to done. And that's pretty much it. The server is now installing. If you go into the summary, you can see activity on the CPU, the memory is being consumed, things are moving. So yeah, just hang tight while this is done. Once this is done, this will reboot. So as you can see here, it actually has installed the server OS, or rather server version of Ubuntu on the VM, and it was actually installing a couple of security updates. And it's actually done right now. The install is finished and it's asking me to reboot. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to hit the enter button and reboot. So Ubuntu is now ready for login, but that's it. We're not going to use Proxmox as an interface. We're going to go to SSH. SSH is installed, so it should work fine. But how are we going to connect SSH? So let's first log in. So as you can see here, we've logged in, and with Ubuntu, you can see the IP address immediately over here, 176. However, if your flavor of Linux does not show you this nice login screen with the IP, it's quite simple. All you do is type in IP space A, hit enter. You will see your adapter here, and you can see the internet or the IP address right here. So it's 176. So use your favorite SSH client. I like the SolarWinds Solar Putty. It's a free tool. I really like it. I hate the ads, but the actual thing is the actual client is really nice, and I use it quite a lot. So we're going to go to the IP address, which is 192.168.1.176. We're going to hit enter. It's immediately going to say that there's a new fingerprint. We're going to hit yes to accept it, and as you can see, we can now log in. So Z and Z, and there we go. So as you can see, it's basically the same thing, but you know, this doesn't get piped through a virtual graphics adapter and whatnot and over the network. I find this much more efficient. So let's expand the screen and let's have a look. So first thing what we want to do is we want to do a sudo apt update. So what this is going to do is going to go through all the repositories and find the packages that need to be updated. So we have 6 packages that can be updated. And we're going to do another command, which is sudo apt upgrade. And if you notice, I got this command quickly by just pressing the up arrow key, which is repeats, or rather types in the last command you run. So it's going to be sudo apt upgrade. It's going to tell us that these are the packages that will be upgraded. I'm just going to hit enter because yes is the default value. Okay, so that is done now. I usually like to give it a reboot, so we're going to do sudo reboot. That reboots the VM. Now, you don't need to reboot. I just have a habit of doing it. You know, it's just better to do it simply because if there's any issues with the updates or package upgrades, you can catch it before, you know, doing more work on it. So it comes up pretty quickly. We're going to log in as Z again. We're going to hit clear. Second thing I like to do is as follows, which is configure. Or rather, let me explain you what I'm doing. If you type in date right now, you can see here that while the date is correct, the time is set to UTC. It's completely wrong. This is not the time right now. The time right now actually is 4:49. So this is actually offset by quite a bit. So to fix that, what we're going to do is as follows. So sudo. Again, if you don't know what sudo is the command that basically elevates your user to the root privileges, right? So temporarily to run the command, and it falls back to your normal user privileges. So sudo dpkg-reconfigure okay, and TZ data. So TZ data is time zone data. We hit enter. It's going to ask you for your password again, for the root password, which is Z. And as you can see, it brings you an interface where you can select. So I'm going to select America. I'm going to go all the way down to Toronto, where I live. I'm going to hit enter. As you can see here now, it automatically changed it. The local time is now 1650 Eastern Daylight Time. So if I type in date again, there we go. So time zone changed, time is proper, everything looks good. So I found a really good resource on how to install Docker on Ubuntu 20.04, and honestly, it's very, very nice. Very, very easy. You could pretty much copy paste most of the commands and you will get it up and running. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to copy this command here. It's always good to read commands before you copy them blindly so you understand what's going on. So sudo apt install, it's installing packages. It's installing these packages: apt transport HTTPS, certificates, curl, the GNU PG agent, and software properties common. So these are pretty safe and regular packages. So we're going to copy that, go into the SSH client, and we're going to paste it and hit enter. It's going to ask you, do you want to continue? We're going to hit yes. Perfect. We're going to go back to the website. The next step is to add the repository's private key into your machine. Basically, what this means is that in the Ubuntu packages or the repository, Docker does not exist. However, Docker does host its own version on their repository. So you can see here, download.docker.com, Linux, and Ubuntu. They have their own version that's compatible with Ubuntu, but it's hosted by Docker. So we want to add this repository into Ubuntu so that whenever we run apt-get, it also searches this repository. So the command is quite simple. It's curl and then some SSL stuff. Basically, we're going to add the key, so we're basically trusting this repository. So copy and paste again. We're going to hit enter. And it says OK, so this task is done. The next one is to add the Docker Apt repository to our system. So again, we're going to copy this. We're going to go back. We're going to hit enter. So as you can see, that when you've added the apt repository, it automatically gets, or rather searches for the packages available in the Docker repository as well as the Ubuntu. And you can see here, Docker. So we've got it all here, all done. Now, it asks you to do a sudo apt update. So sudo apt update. It is done. So now it knows all the packages in all of these repositories. And we're going to install Docker CE, CLI, and containerd.io. So we're going to copy this command. I'm going to hit copy. And we're going to paste it here. It's going to tell you that additional packages will be installed. So you can see here all these things. New packages will be installed. Everything looks good. We're just going to hit enter for yes. And this may take some time depending on your network connection. So grab yourself a beer or a coffee or any beverage of your choice and stand by. Okay, so my internet connection is fairly good, and my machine's my virtual machine is actually quite good too. So it didn't take too long. Probably took 30 seconds at the most. Now Docker is installed. Now there's some options here about installing a specific version of Docker. We don't really want that. We want just the latest version. Once Docker's installation is completed, Docker service will start automatically. We can verify it by typing in this command. So we're going to paste the command here. And as you can see that Docker is running. There's a couple of warning messages here, but that's completely fine. One last thing we want to do is run this command, and it's quite self-explanatory, is that by default, Docker will only run root and users with sudo privileges. So if we want to add a non-root user, which is my username Z, to run Docker, we actually need to run this command. We're going to copy, and we're going to paste it and hit enter. After we've done that, you can see here the line goes to the next line, means the command worked properly. So we actually have Docker running on our Ubuntu installation, but what are we going to do next? So you could use command line and do everything you want to your heart's content through the command line, but I like using a GUI for that. One of the best GUIs I've found is Portainer, and Portainer is very nice. If you go to portainer.io, you can just click the installation link, and here are the commands you have to run. So these are actually Docker command line commands that will run Portainer. So again, if you read it, the first command is to create a volume called Portainer data. And we'll get to that in another video about what the benefits and detriments of creating a volume are. But for the case of Portainer, I think that this is the right thing to do. So we're going to create a volume called Portainer data. And hit paste, hit enter. Perfect. So this is a good example of what happens. So it said permission denied. Now, you remember the command we ran here, which is to add our user, which is user Z, to the Docker group so that it can run the commands? Well, one thing I failed to do was to log out. So this changes will only be applied once I log in again. So if I log out, and if I connect back to my server again, so 192.168.1.176, and if I log in with my name, I should be able to run that command without any problems. So let's copy that again. If I paste, there we go. So the trick was to log out and log back in again. So as you can see here, that a volume was created called Portainer data. The second command is a long one, but it's fairly simple. Basically, it's going to create a port at port 8000, and it's going to expose it on the VM as 8000, and internally it's V8000, another port 9000, 9000. It's going to give it a name of Portainer, always restarts. There's a volume, another volume, Portainer data, here we go. So it's a fairly simple command to understand. So we're just going to copy the whole line here. Copy, and we're going to hit paste, and we're going to hit enter. So since it didn't find the image locally, it is going to pull it from the Docker Hub or the Docker repository. The pull is complete, everything is done, and that container is actually now running. You have successfully set up your first container. To log in, it's very simple, is 192.168.1.176, which is the IP of our machine, and port 9000. So here we go. Very easy. So we're going to set up the username as admin. We're going to make the password whatever you want, and we're going to confirm the password, and we're going to, well, it's asking you for 8 characters long. Okay, let's do that. Okay, and we're going to create the user. Once that's created, Portainer allows you to connect in multiple ways to Docker. So if you're using Portainer installed on this machine, so 176, but you want to administer another Docker instance that has another IP, you could do that. However, we want to manage our local Docker environment. So we're going to hit that, and we're going to hit connect. And there we go. We're connected, everything's all good. We're going to hit dismiss on this news, and that's your Portainer. So you can see here that the local machine is here. We're going to click this, and you can see we have one container, which is Portainer. We have one volume, which was Portainer data, which we created through the command line, and one image, which is Portainer latest. This is the image it downloaded from Docker Hub. Furthermore, we have 3 networks, which is the host, bridge, and none. These are all default, and that's completely fine. That concludes the first chapter of how to set up Ubuntu, Docker, and Portainer on a virtualized Proxmox environment. In the next edition of this video, I will explain you on how I set up things like this, all these services, and more. Thank you very much. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe, and adios.